Hey guys, welcome back to Star Wars Month, and today we're looking at the second Star Wars prequel, Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. So after The Phantom Menace came out, fans were quite underwhelmed, but they still had a lot of confidence that the next Star Wars prequel would improve drastically over the first one. So they still tried to stay positive. What resulted was a film that has gotten a reputation as being the worst of the entire series. Attack of the Clones often appears at the bottom of Star Wars lists when ranking them from best to worst, and for very good reason. The story of the film takes place a couple years after The Phantom Menace. Anakin Skywalker has grown up now and is training under Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's starting to develop a romance, you could call it, for Padme Amidala, who is no longer a queen but a senator. However, someone is trying to assassinate her, and so Obi-Wan has to figure out who that is, while Anakin takes her back to her home planet of Naboo to develop an extremely horrible relationship with her. Even when I was a kid and I liked the prequels, Attack of the Clones was still my least favorite. I still enjoyed it for its action scenes, but I could tell that there was definitely something wrong with the dialogue. Some people think Attack of the Clones is an improvement over The Phantom Menace, and I think the main reason why is just expectations. People were so confident that The Phantom Menace would be great, so when it disappointed them, it felt like the worst thing ever. With Attack of the Clones, they were a little bit more prepared for disappointment, so it didn't feel as bad. But when you really look at them as films overall, yeah, I think it's pretty easy to tell which one's worse. There are definitely some things that this film does improve upon over The Phantom Menace. The biggest one would be Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan actually has a character this time round and actually shows emotion. There are some nice moments between him and Anakin where he shows some father-like qualities. He does scold Anakin from time to time, but you can tell that deep down inside he still cares about him. Their friendship in this film almost worked. He actually has a part to play in this story. He becomes sort of a Jedi detective, as he has to track down the assassin who was trying to kill Padme. Truthfully, the whole movie would have been so much better if it was just about him, and it was just so great to actually have his character acting like a human being again. He even has a couple of funny lines. There's actually a lot more comedy in this film than the last one. Some of it works, mainly the ones with Obi-Wan, others not so much. Another obvious improvement over the last film is that Jar Jar Binks is in this film much less. He appears in a couple of scenes, and there is one especially infuriating scene with Jar Jar in this movie, where he gives emergency powers to Palpatine. So, of course, the Empire was created because of Jar Jar. Honestly, that scene alone I find 100 times more anger-inducing than any scene with him in Episode 1, even if he is in this movie less. But unfortunately, there is way too much bad stuff in this movie to call it better than the last one. Let's talk about Anakin Skywalker. Now, as I said in my review of The Phantom Menace, Anakin Skywalker in that film was written fairly well. Unfortunately, he was somewhat ruined because Jake Lloyd's acting was just bad. But had they gotten a better child actor to play him, I think it would have worked. Here, however, not only is Hayden Christensen just awful in this role, but the way that his character is written makes him annoying and totally unlikable. This movie focused way too much on the negative side of Anakin. I understand that he is eventually going to become Darth Vader, but we have to get to know his good side first. Some of you might argue that we got to know his good side in The Phantom Menace, but the thing is, he feels like a completely different character. It doesn't feel like the natural progression of one character. It feels like one movie starring a kid who's very kind and likable, and then another movie starring an annoying, insecure teenager who happens to have the same name. As everybody has said, his character is not only whiny and annoying, but also a perv. The way that he looks at Padme, you just think he's gonna sexually assault her or something. The only time in the film where I actually felt like his character actually acted like a nice, good person around Padme was when they arrive on Naboo and he's carrying her luggage for her, and saying things like, "I think the Republic needs you." Okay, well, that's a nice thing to say. His character goes through extreme changes in tone. There's one scene between him and Padme where he starts talking about how that they must let go of their pride and do what is requested of them, and he's actually acting like a mature person. But then a couple seconds later, he's bitching and moaning because Obi-Wan apparently doesn't understand how powerful he is. Yeah, because he's apparently more powerful than any Jedi ever, I guess. Why? Because his midichlorians said so. Ooh. His character unfortunately ruins the whole friendship dynamic between him and Obi-Wan in this film, because the way that he always talks about Obi-Wan, you'd swear that he hates him with a passion. The whole sequence where Anakin goes off to find his mother who's been killed by Tusken Raiders, and then he goes on a killing spree, murdering every single one of them, even the children. That whole sequence should have been the turning point of his character. The first half of the film should have been setting him up as a kind, sweet, confident, good person. Then after killing the Tusken Raiders, his character goes down a much darker path. Oh yeah, and don't have him tell Padme about it. You'd have to be an idiot to do something like that. But I guess Padme's an idiot too, because after admitting that he's murdered women and children, a couple scenes later she tells him that she loves him and marries him, despite the fact that it's against the Jedi's rules. Yes. It's worth breaking the rules just to marry this guy, despite him being a serial killer. The writing for Anakin is just awful. So many cringeworthy lines, and also too many lines. There are so many scenes of him saying what he's feeling instead of just showing it. I want to be all powerful. I will learn to stop people from dying. They're animals, and I slaughtered them like animals. Obi-Wan never listens to me. It's not fair. Shut up. Padme returns in this film as well. Now, thankfully she doesn't sound like a computer this time round, but unfortunately her character is ruined as well by the writing, because like Anakin, she has to say so much horrible dialogue. And this movie just turns her character into a complete twit. As everybody has said, there is absolutely no reason for her to fall in love with Anakin. With the exception of 1 or 2 scenes, he shows no signs of being anything but a psycho. Certainly not a decent person that any woman would even think about marrying unless they too were crazy. When I was a kid, I was always just distracted by this dialogue. I always thought to myself, is this really how people talk to each other? And now that I'm older, I know for a fact that no, this is not how people talk to each other. Instead of having natural dialogue that actual human beings would say, similar to the love dialogue between Leia and Han in the original trilogy, we instead have this terrible, ridiculous, over-the-top love dialogue that just makes you want to vomit. And none of this feels at all like Star Wars. It feels like some terrible attempt to recreate Romeo and Juliet or something. It's not exciting. It's not interesting. It's just torturous. What about the other characters of this movie? Well, we have Mace Windu, played by Samuel L. Jackson, and he's just not interesting. It's so sad to see a great actor like Samuel L. Jackson being put in a role that's just so boring. Yes, his character has a purple lightsaber. Does that make him awesome? No. In fact, that's kind of silly. Who on earth wants a purple lightsaber? He does definitely have some badass moments, but other than that, he's just a boring, stale character. So is Yoda, for that matter. Yeah, the Yoda of the prequels is just not Yoda. The Yoda of the original trilogy, while serious, still threw in some good humor, making his character charming and enjoyable. In the prequels, they just sucked out all of his humor and made him completely serious and very boring. The choice to make him CGI was definitely an understandable idea, but unfortunately, it doesn't look nearly as good as the puppet that they used in the original trilogy. Now, to be fair, it looks much better than the god-awful puppet that they used in Episode 1, but still, people are very split on the scene where he fights with a lightsaber. Some people think it's stupid and it goes against his character, while others find it to be awesome. Personally, I'm the former. In the original trilogy, it was clearly built up that Yoda's main power was the Force, like any Jedi. He didn't even need a lightsaber because he was so powerful. Being a Jedi wasn't about how many flips or tricks you could do, it was simply about how strong you could use the Force. But now this movie throws all of that out the window. Now apparently you have to be strong and agile and fast in order to be a Jedi. The scenes in the prequels when he uses the Force to his advantage is awesome. That's Yoda. He doesn't need a lightsaber, he's just got the Force. It was just so sad to see such a great Star Wars character being portrayed like this. The coolest character in this movie is definitely Jango Fett. I know everybody talks about how awesome Boba Fett was in the original trilogy, but in my opinion, Jango is even cooler. First of all, Jango actually gets to do stuff. He has an important role to to play in the story, as he is one of the people behind the assassination attempt on Padme. Several of the scenes involving him are some of the best in the film, like the fight between him and Obi-Wan and the arena battle. His character still kinda dies in an anticlimactic way like his son Boba Fett did, but at least he actually got to do some stuff. However, then we come to one of my least favorite aspects of this movie, the main villain, Count Dooku. The late, great Sir Christopher Lee is one of my favorite actors of all time, playing many of my favorite villains. But Count Dooku? Boring. Especially as a follow-up to Darth Maul, who is just such a cool and interesting character. Count Dooku is just a boring old man with some powers. There's nothing very villainous or interesting or memorable about his character. For goodness sake, when we first see him in the movie, he's just having a business meeting, and his character acts way too friendly to be threatening. Now, if maybe they were building his character up, like he starts out acting very friendly, but as the film goes on, we start to see his true psychotic and vicious nature inside. But we never do. He's just a stale, boring, and uninteresting villain. Compare him to another Christopher Lee villain, Saruman, from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Saruman was an evil, psychotic wizard who had the intent of wiping out all of mankind. He sends his soldiers to go burn villages and even murder children. If you reject him, he will make sure that you suffer greatly. He had a scary and almost psychotic feel to him. This was easily the best villain that Christopher Lee had ever played. Dooku has none of that. The biggest thing that stands out about him is how that his lightsaber has a curved hilt. That's really one of the only things I ever remember about his character. And yet for some stupid reason, instead of killing him off like they did with Darth Maul, they had his character live in Attack of the Clones so he could be a primary antagonist throughout the Clone Wars series. Only to have him be killed off at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, thank God. But still, what the heck? We traded in Darth Maul for this guy? Most of the Star Wars villains have something monstrous and inhuman about them, and those that don't are still interesting characters. Dooku is just forgettable. How is the story of this film? Well, I could say that parts of it are interesting. The stuff with Obi-Wan trying to find out who's trying to kill Padme is quite interesting, though it still isn't truly Star Wars, but whatever. The film kind of takes a similar direction as The Empire Strikes Back by having our characters split up and intercutting two different stories. But the thing about The Empire Strikes Back was that those two different stories were both interesting and both had you engaged. Here, it looks like we're watching some sort of Star Wars-like film intercut with some god-awful romance film. We're starting to get engaged with Obi-Wan's story as he's slowly finding out who's behind this assassination attempt. Then suddenly we cut back to Anakin and Padme delivering more cringeworthy love dialogue. The Anakin and Padme story could have been pretty much cut out of this movie. It shouldn't be the heart of the story. The heart of the story should be his friendship with Obi-Wan. Instead, we have a couple scenes at the beginning between him and Obi-Wan, then they split up and they're only reunited at the end, only to have them argue some more. The film would have been much better if both Anakin and Padme went with Obi-Wan on his mission to find the assassin. Then when they get to the planet Geonosis, the film starts to get somewhat exciting by actually having some real action. Though, to be fair, the action becomes very video game-ish as it goes on. And yeah, let's talk about the CGI. This film pretty much went 95% CGI, and that was a bad idea, because a lot of the shots of this movie feel like they're out of a video game. The scenes with Obi-Wan visiting Kamino look like he's inside of one of those 3D video games. He's talking with the Prime Minister of the planet, and they're sitting on these, like, giant silver liquid metal spoons. It's just weird. Barely a single shot in this movie doesn't have CGI in it. Thus, it makes this universe feel even more artificial. Little to no practical effects were used. When they are used, it's like finding a gem inside of a giant turd. Now, granted, there are still some interesting effects in this film. The opening chase sequence on Coruscant, where Anakin and Obi-Wan pursue the assassin Zam Wesell, does have some very interesting visuals. Again, I like that we get to see more of Coruscant. It looks like something out of the movie Blade Runner. It's quite interesting. But then you have other scenes of real people interacting with CGI ones, and it just doesn't blend well. Characters like Dexter Jetster and those weird aliens on Kamino don't fit in this environment. And every single one of the clone troopers are CGI. Not a single one was a real person in armor. That is just sad. The film certainly does do a good job of expanding the galaxy and showing us some new interesting worlds. We do return to Naboo and Tatooine, but we also get planets like Kamino, which is like a giant water planet. And while the CGI does look like crap in some areas, it does still look interesting. Geonosis is a very cool looking planet as well. It's basically a giant desert with these weird bug-like creatures walking around. But again, none of it feels real. It all feels like it was manufactured on a computer, which it was. Again, I really miss the way that they used to do it in the old Star Wars movies, by having real actors on real sets. Still, when there is action, it can be entertaining. There is certainly less of the battle droids this time round, and there are some action scenes that really do stick out. My favorite is definitely the fight between Obi-Wan and Jango Fett. It has some nice, gritty hand-to-hand combat. The location is very exciting. And there's even some good suspense as Obi-Wan starts falling off and Jango has to undo his grappling hook, making Obi-Wan fall. And Obi-Wan just at the last minute uses the grappling hook to save himself, which kind of is stupid, but hey, at least there's some action going on. The asteroid field chase scene is also quite fun. There's some good action, and especially good sound design with the seismic charges. The arena battle scene starts out very exciting, as we see Anakin, Padme, and Obi-Wan facing off against these different arena beasts with very interesting designs. We have the Reek that looks like a giant bull, the Accolade, which looks like a giant praying mantis, and the Nexu that looks like some sort of horrifying mutated cat. It's cool seeing all these characters take on these different creatures in different ways. Obi-Wan fights the Accolade with a spear, and Anakin tames the Reek and actually starts riding it around. However, then the Jedi and battle droids show up and it just gets boring. It just kind of turns into a video game. We have more Jedi just cutting through these stupid toothpicks like they're nothing, and no sense of tension. Now granted, there is a little bit of tension eventually when the super battle droids come into the mix, and the Jedis are actually outnumbered and are almost killed, only to be saved at the last minute by the clone troopers and Yoda. Then this leads into a very interesting and visually stunning action scene, as the clones and the battle droids duke it out. But unfortunately, most of our main characters are on a gunship and not actually engaged in the battle. Then there's the final lightsaber battle of this movie, which is sadly very weak. It could easily be called the worst lightsaber battle of the franchise. Even the one in the original Star Wars, while not very well choreographed, did still have some good emotion in there with the death of Obi-Wan. This fight scene is not only slow in the way it's choreographed, but has no real emotional impact, and is extremely underwhelming when compared to the Darth Maul battle from the last film. The fight can be very slow and awkward at times. There's this one part where Anakin slices a cable, sparks start flying, and then he and Dooku just slowly hold their lightsabers up in the air before finally attacking each other. And then of course Yoda comes along, and the fight of course spits on everything that Yoda stood for in the original trilogy. Dooku openly says, "It is obvious this contest cannot be decided by our knowledge of the Force, but by our skills with a lightsaber." Yes, that's what it's all about, as we all know. And the film ends in the most stupid and out of place way that any Star Wars film could ever end, with a wedding. Attack of the Clones is a mess. It still can be enjoyable in some areas. Like The Phantom Menace, there are still some enjoyable aspects. John Williams, as usual, delivers a kick-ass score. The love theme is actually quite beautiful and almost makes this god-awful love story work. There are still some fun, interesting action scenes, some cool ideas, and the sound design, again, is really good. But the story is boring. The love story is awful. Anakin's character is obnoxious, not to mention rather creepy. As far as I'm concerned, he's Darth Vader already. Attack of the Clones is still a watchable film like The Phantom Menace, but nonetheless is very, very disappointing and extremely cringeworthy in a lot of areas. It is easily the worst of the theatrically released Star Wars films. I said theatrically released. It's watchable, but still, nonetheless, the worst of the bunch. I give it a 5 out of 10. So there's my review of Attack of the Clones, and join me next time as I review what many consider the best Star Wars prequel, Revenge of the Sith. Till then, I'm Jack, and I will see you next time.